All right. Hi, everyone. Professor Martin here for week 2 of Speech 101. I tried to video record this when I taught it in class on Friday, this lecture, but unfortunately the video system wasn't working. It needed a software update or software to be downloaded, so I wasn't able to video record it this week, but in future weeks, hopefully we'll have that resolved. So the lectures I do on Friday, I will post on Tuesday. But for this week, I will video record this just for this course. And so I'm not going to do, on Friday, the activities, the breaks, the lecture took, the entire time. So 2 hours and 50 minutes. So I'm not going to take that entire time with this video recording. I will probably do just an abbreviated version. So let's get started. So week 2 is where we're at. We have classmate introduction speeches this week, and so I'm excited to learn more about you and to watch your classmate introductions. Hopefully you got to learn a little bit more about each other, and that's the point of this specific assignment, is to learn more about your classmates and practice introducing them to the class. The introduction speech is a good model, a good example for other speeches. It's kind of the basics. When we talk about informative speaking, we have the introduction part of that, which has the acknowledge step, the rapport step, credibility step. So those things that you're already doing in this introduction speech, you're going to mirror that when you get into the informative speech and the persuasive speech. So you're getting good habits. You're starting good habits with these speeches. So this was the script that was included with the classmate introduction speech. It was posted on Brightspace. Hopefully you found that helpful. I also do this question of the day, and so I'm going to post this as a discussion post because I want to know from you what you're looking for from this course. So my question of the day this week, a couple questions. I start out by saying I want you to remember that you are in charge of getting what you want from this course. I can be your coach, I can be your guide, but ultimately you are in charge of the experience that you have and getting the most from this course. And so I want to know, what are 2 objectives or goals that you have from your time here in Speech 101? We're going to be meeting virtually, we're going to be meeting online, throughout the majority of the semester, and then for speeches, we're going to meet in person. And so I hope by providing the syllabus, you will see which days are in person and which days are online. But so we're not going to be seeing each other in person every week. And so I want to know from you, what are you looking to get from this experience, from this online course, this online speech course, and from speech in general, fundamentals of speech in general. I also would like to know your current or desired profession. I know you all shared that when we met in class in person. A lot of you shared what you did, but I would like to know, what's your current or desired profession? And so maybe you're currently in that desired profession, maybe you're looking to achieve that. And so again, I want to know, what are your 2 objectives or goals that you have from this course? Because I want to help you achieve those goals. So that's the first one. And the second one is, what's your current or desired profession? Are you where you want to be, or do you have a goal or a dream or a profession that's out there that you are interested in attaining? Maybe that profession is raising children, right? So when I say profession, I don't necessarily mean like working a job. There's a lot of professions that are vital to our society that people may not usually lump into the category profession, but I do. And so, so let me know, what are your dreams, what are your goals, not just with this course, but professionally, or with your career, or with your life. So what I had people do in class was, on an index card, I had them put their full name, preferred name, pronouns, and then their answers to those questions. And so when I post this on Brightspace, I would like that same thing: a full name, preferred name. So for example, my full name is Timothy Edward Martin Jr. My preferred name is going to be TJ, or Professor Martin. My pronouns, so this is, if you haven't experienced this before, it's common now, or it kind of expected, that we don't assume that someone is the gender that they would necessarily born or assigned with at birth. And so it's common practice now to claim, hey, I go by he, him, his, or I go by she, her, hers, or I don't prefer either of those pronouns. I prefer they, them, theirs. And so I want to know what pronouns you go by. And then the answers to those questions. So let's talk a little bit about speaking in public. And like I said, I'm going to do an abbreviated version this week. This comes straight from the textbook. So this is foundational basic speech 101. So the power of public speaking. So public speaking are ways of making our ideas public, ways of making our ideas known to the world. And it's important for career, but it's also important for civic engagement. We're going to touch on that a little bit later in class. Let's talk about some of the similarities and differences between public speaking and a conversation, because there are differences and there are similarities. And it's helpful to know what you do in everyday life translates to what you do in speeches, or what you do in everyday life that doesn't translate or transfer into public speaking. So let's go through the similarities. And this comes from the textbook, so that's why I'm going to go through it somewhat quickly. So similarities: to organize thoughts logically, to tailor messages to your audience, tell stories for maximum impact, and adapt to feedback. So ultimately, the similarities are you're trying to get your message across to your audience. You have to tailor that to your audience. If you're not necessarily going to have, or some of the conversations that you have with adults, you're not necessarily going to have with children. So you need to be mindful of your audience. The power of storytelling really is key to public speaking. If a lot of you, or many of you, have gone online and seen TED, the TED speeches, a lot of those speakers are telling stories and get you pulled in and drawn into a story. So stories, we're storytelling beings, right? We remember in stories, we share life experiences through stories, we learn lessons through stories. Generation after generation is passed down, knowledge is passed down through stories. So storytelling is really essential to both conversations in our everyday life and public speaking. And then adapting to feedback. So you have to be mindful of what your audience is hearing. And if they are sending signals back to you that say they're not interested, they're bored, they're angry, they're upset, they're hungry, whatever that might be, you're going to need to adapt to that feedback and change your message accordingly. Some of the differences. So public speaking is highly structured, right? So there are set principles in how to design and develop and deliver speeches. And so that's what this class is going to teach you. It's going to teach you those foundations, those basic principles that are common practice, right? Public speaking requires more formal language. So we don't use slang, we don't use jargon. If we're using some kind of terminology that our audience doesn't understand, it's our obligation to explain that to them. We can't just assume. But overall, the preference is not to use that slang, not to use jargon, but to use more formal professional language. And then public speaking requires a different method of delivery than conversation. A lot of people may say that, oh, that speaker was conversational, right? Or that speaker had a very conversational tone. Well, that's pretty common, but that may be an approach to speaking, right? But it's not all there is. And we're going to go through the different methods of delivery. We're going to go through techniques and strategies for delivery. So we're going to go more in depth into that. We know that public speaking really does focus on the delivery method. Being conversational is good, but in a public speech, you need to do more than just be conversational, right? There's a little more to it. Let's talk a little bit about communication anxiety. It's communication anxiety, communication apprehension, communication or stage fright. So all of those are the same thing. So this is anxiety over the prospect of speaking before an audience. I'm going to adjust my camera down just a little bit so I can stand back. So anxiety over the prospect of speaking in front of the audience. We all get stage fright. We do. Everyone does. Even the most professional speakers. When I was speaking before 30, 50, 100, 500 people, Getting up before a House of Delegates of 1,000 people and speaking, you still get those butterflies in your stomach. It's about figuring out how to control those butterflies and use them to your benefit. How do you reduce speech anxiety, or this communication anxiety or communication apprehension? Well, 3 or 4 recommendations. One is acquire experience. And that's why in this speech, every week you're doing a speech, right? It's getting you in that routine, getting you that practice, getting you that experience that is important for helping you reduce your speech anxiety. Every time I teach this class, pardon me, I'll take the water. Every time I teach this class and we go over the syllabus, a lot of students get a lot of anxiety. It's like, oh my goodness, we have a speech to do every week. Yes, you do. There's a speech to do every week, and and that gets you that experience. When it comes evaluation time, overwhelmingly, students at the end of the semester, they realize, they see that doing those speeches every week prepare them for those speeches that are really done for a grade, right? That informative speech, persuasive speech, commemorative speech, and group presentation. Those are the heavy hitters, right? Those are the ones that are weighted the most as far as your grade goes. So doing these small 10-point, 20-point, 30-point speeches help prepare you so you're less anxious, you have less apprehension when it comes time to deliver those speeches for a serious grade. Prepare, prepare, prepare. I encourage students to write it, deliver it, revise it, deliver it, revise it, deliver it. The more prepared you are, the less anxiety you're going to have about giving that speech. The more prepared you are, the better you're going to deliver it as far as extemporaneous delivery style. Extemporaneous is when you choose the words at the moment of delivery. And so prepare, rewrite, revise, and then and do that multiple times. The sooner you can get to that first draft that you can then deliver and revise, the better you're going to be, and the more prepared you're going to feel when it comes time to deliver that for a grade. If you're delivering it for a grade and you've only practiced it once, or you've only revised it once, that's not enough. You have to get there first, get that first draft done, and then at least get a couple revisions in, a couple practices in, right? And go from there. And then think positively. So the power of positive thinking is super important when it comes to speaking, public speaking. Pardon me. It's been a long day. I'm not sure what time it is, but it's been a long day, so my mouth and brain are a little tired. But think positively, right? So when you get up there, envision yourself being successful, right? Have a vision of yourself doing it right, doing it well, right? And that power of positive thinking is going to get you through and help you reduce that speech anxiety. Power of visualization, right? Visualize yourself in the space delivering the speech. I tell students that when I was in college and I was preparing speeches, either for a speech tournament or for class, I would go into the classroom or go into a classroom after hours, right? I'd pop by, I'd ask, tell the security officer, hey, George, can I, pop in and practice my speech real quick before the building shuts down? I'd get in there, practice it, rehearse it. I was in that space and I could visualize myself actually giving the speech with a room full of my classmates. I would even be able to hear the applause when I got done, right? And picture that, right? And even go as far as to thank you very much at the very end, right? Like go through and visualize yourself doing it and doing it well. If you don't have a classroom you can step into, use what you have, right? So I could go into a classroom and stand behind a lectern and practice like I was in the classroom giving it for a grade. But there were times where I didn't always have that option. So I would stack books on top of each other and put my note cards out on those books. And I would stand in front of a mirror, right? These books piled up and these note cards out, just like I would do. I'd put my note cards out on the lectern and rehearse in front of the mirror and visualize myself doing it before an audience. Know that most nervousness is not visible to your audience. It's more visible to you. So don't tell us you're nervous, right? That damages your credibility. Don't tell us because we're not going to know. Even if you mess up, don't apologize. Don't say, I'm sorry. If you're nervous, it's okay. The more you practice, the more you visualize, right? The more you're going to be able to control those butterflies in the moment. But know that everyone's nervous. Even the most professional speakers are nervous. And you work through that, you get through that. So don't tell us you're nervous. Don't apologize if you mess up. Just pick up where you left off, or pause and start over, right? So keep moving forward. And don't expect perfection, right? We're all human. We all make errors. We're not perfect. Your audience isn't expecting perfection, right? They know you're not perfect. So you shouldn't expect perfection of yourself either. Positive nervousness is that term, right, where we have these butterflies, and it's using those butterflies to energize you as a speaker, right? So controlled nervousness that energizes the speaker for their presentation. So I encourage you, utilize that nervousness in a positive way. Visualization, I mentioned, picturing oneself giving a successful presentation. Another concept mentioned in the book, critical thinking. So this is focused, organized thinking. It involves relationships among ideas, soundness of evidence, differences between facts and opinion. So really being critical, right? Really honing in and really looking at the differences, right, between information that's being presented to you, right? Is this sound, right? Is this logical? Is there supporting evidence, right? Is this someone's opinion of how they want it to be or think it should be, or is this fact that's verified by research and science? The frame of reference, or someone's frame of reference, also could be considered someone's worldview, might be another way to frame it, or paradigm. So this is the sum of a person's knowledge, experience, goals, values, and attitudes. And this frame of reference is what we look through, right? It's like this window that we look through to see the world. And everyone has a different frame of reference. And so you, as a speaker, have to understand that your audience is diverse, right? Your audience have these different frames of reference. And so it's up to you to do what you can to tailor your message to your audience so that your message will reach the audience. And so if you can do an analysis of the audience, do it so you know what are my audience's experiences, what are their values, what are their attitudes, so that you can make sure your message gets across to them. So the frame of reference, everything is filtered through the listener's frame of reference, and no two people have the same frame of reference or worldview. Ethnocentrism, right? We want to avoid ethnocentrism. This is believing that one's group or culture is superior to all other groups or cultures. We can be guilty of this as a speaker, and our audience also can be guilty of ethnocentrism. How do we avoid ethnocentrism? One is to respect our listeners' cultural values. In order to respect our listeners' cultural values, you got to know your listeners' cultural values, right? You got to know if you're challenging those values or if you're reinforcing those values. And so that's why it's important to do an audience analysis so you know who your audience is. Another way to avoid ethnocentrism is imagine yourself in place of your listeners. If you were listening to your speech, how would someone from a different demographic group perceive that? And the best way to do that is to video record or audio record your speech and listen to it. And to give your speech to friends and family and have them provide you feedback. Be alert to that feedback. Be welcoming to that feedback. And know that listeners also have to avoid ethnocentrism. And they're not always, just like we're not always the best at doing that. So let's transition a little bit into what is communication. This is foundational communication 101. But it's important. It's important we have a good understanding of what this is. So, what is communication? Some common definitions. The first is the sending and receiving of message. Basic, right? The sending and receiving of a message. Let me turn that down. The second is the perception, interpretation, and response of people to messages produced by other people. There are 5 characteristics of communication. And I'm going to go more in depth into these. The first is it's symbolic. The second is it's personal. The third is it's a transactional process. The fourth is it's a process that requires both a sender and a receiver. And the fifth is it's a relational process. So let's dive into what each of these are. But first, I want to do an activity. I want you to, on a piece of paper, this could be a scratched sheet of paper. I passed out 3x5 index cards in class for students just to draw. But I want you to draw your interpretation of what the following word looks like to you. So what do you think of or picture in your mind when you see this word? Rock. So I'll give you just a couple moments to think. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you see this word, rock? There's no right or wrong answer. I want you to draw your interpretation of rock. It's going to be a rock, the rock, rocks, but rock. What's the first thing you think of? You have it? Have your picture? Take a sip of water. All right. Most important thing is you have it in your mind. What do you visualize when you see the word rock? What's the first thing you visualize? You may think of other things. What's the first thing you think of or visualize, a picture, when you see the word rock? So, was it something like this, like a pebble or a stone? I had one student just draw a circle, and that was their stone or pebble that they envisioned when they saw the word rock. Maybe it was more of a boulder, right? So like a large rock, something that you might climb on or climb on top of. So a stone or a boulder. So maybe that was something what you drew. How about this? Did you draw like a mountain, like rock climbing, like a rock face, right? That you would climb on or take a picture of, like pictured here. Did you draw a diamond or gemstone? So that's another interpretation of rock. How about this kind of rock? I usually get some laughs with people who are sometimes surprised, but illegal drugs, right? Was that the first thing you thought of when you saw the word rock? Or maybe this, maybe music, rock and roll, right? Rock star. So this is an example of words or language requiring shared meaning. So here's a couple things to point out. One is, for you to know my version of rock, you may need to know the context or my background, right? If I was a rock climber, then my interpretation of rock might equate to a rock face, right? If I was big into gems, gemstones, then maybe a rock was related to that. So you need to know a little bit about me, about this context, right? If we were at a rock concert and I use the word rock, then of course I would most likely be utilizing it in reference to that. So in order to know my version of rock, you need to know the context, you need to know my background, we need to have some kind of shared understanding, shared meaning for that word. Same thing goes for a chair. We could call a chair a stool, a seat. They look different, right? So I have an office chair back here, right? I have a stool at home. It's like a round seat. So language is symbolic, right? And we know that a chair is a chair because of that shared meaning. Regardless of what language you're speaking, right? Regardless of what the word is, we equate that word to something. So the 5 characteristics of communication, they're symbolic, they're personal, it's a transactional process, it involves both a sender and a receiver, and it's relational. So it's symbolic. So we use words to represent something else, right? The word rock is not a rock. The word rock represents a rock. We could call it fliggity-goop, right? And if we had a shared understanding that fliggity-goop meant a rock, then we have that shared meaning, right? So words, we use words to represent something else. Words are arbitrary. It can represent multiple things. Like a chair, could be a stool, right, or a seat. This is why there is misinterpretation and misunderstandings and miscommunication, because we have to have that shared meaning in order to have a shared understanding. When that's not there, there's misunderstanding, misinterpretation, miscommunication. So words only represent items. They're symbols that represent something else. And those symbols are arbitrary. So their meaning must be interpreted. Communication is personal. So because communication is symbolic, the meanings of those words are in us, in people, not in the words themselves, right? The words are arbitrary. So words can and do have different meanings to different people. Words are personal, and meaning is socially constructed. What I mean by socially constructed is the word, and the meaning of that word requires us to have a personal relationship, right? To have that constructed meaning. I'll give you an example. So when I was in graduate school, I did a thesis, right? Really big paper. Really big research paper. So in my thesis, I was looking at the word leadership. I put that in quotations, right? So the word leadership actually means different things to different people. When I say leadership, people think of different things. And so the word leadership, along with a lot of words, is socially constructed. And so what I wanted to determine was, in different academic disciplines, what did leadership mean to them? Right? What was the socially constructed meaning of leadership within that academic discipline? And so I compared 3 academic disciplines. I looked at higher education administration, right? And all of these academic disciplines have courses in leadership. They have textbooks that say leadership in the title, right? So higher education administration, communication studies, which is my discipline, and business, right? Like business administration. So again, all these academic disciplines have business leadership, right? Educational leadership, right? Communication and leadership, right? All of them have courses in that. All of them have textbooks in leadership, right? How to be a leader in business, right? How to communicate like a leader, how to lead in education, right? So there's books, there's courses. So I looked and compared those 3 academic disciplines, and there was some overlap. There were some definitions that they had in common, or some concepts related to leadership that were in common. But there were also some differences, right? I found that those that taught business leadership approach it differently and view leadership differently than those that teach educational leadership. And so in those 2 contexts alone, there's a different meaning to the word leadership. And so that was the research that I did in graduate school, was looking at the social construction of leadership within different academic disciplines. And there's room to grow. I could look at, what does leadership mean in these sciences, right? In biological sciences. I could look at, what does leadership mean within the culinary arts? What does leadership mean within psychology or sociology? What does leadership mean in politics, right? So I could expand that to a lot of other areas. So words are personal and meaning is socially constructed. And again, it's the context, it's the relationship that we have that helps develop that socially constructed meaning. So communication is a transactional process. So it's a complex process that involves senses, feelings, meanings, and cultural experiences. And this process involves working together to create understanding of what words and ideas mean. So it involves this transaction of senses and feelings, and us kind of working together in this communicative process to develop what words and ideas mean. it requires a sender and a receiver. So this goes back to that foundational definition of communication. So a message must be sent and it must be received. If a message is not received, no communication has happened. So it must be sent and received. Now, there's things that impact that, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So communication is relational. So messages are never sent in a vacuum. So every time you express a message and you express ideas, you simultaneously express how you perceive the relationship between yourself and others. So if you're sending a message and the person you're sending the message to does not respond, there might be some things that you perceive about that. Maybe they're upset with me. Maybe they couldn't hear me, right? And so sometimes we make inferences and assumptions based on miscommunication or if no communication happened. But it's important to know that it's relational and that the context and the relationships that we have impact those messages. So they're never sent in a vacuum, right? It's constantly changing and dynamic and involves us having a relationship with each other. And again, if there's some kind of miscommunication, then oftentimes we associate that with the relationship that we have. And like, oh my goodness, did I make them mad? Are they angry with me? So the next thing I want to touch on is specifically the speech communication process, right? So this is, again, foundational COM 101. So the basic speech communication process is this. There's a speaker, there's a message, there's a channel, there's a listener, there's feedback, there's interference, and there's the situation or the context. So let me show you a couple diagrams of this. The first is this linear model of communication, right? Where there's a sender and there's a receiver, and the sender is sending a message. The sender is sending a message, the receiver is receiving that message, and it's just kind of this one way from sender to receiver, right? It's something that someone does to you, right? I send this message to you, right? This was many of the early perspectives of the communication process were this linear model, right? And I'm sending the message along a channel, right? It could be auditory, right? It could be oral, right? It could be a visual channel, right? So I'm sending this through a specific channel. This is the more complex speech communication process that we have come to understand nowadays. So there's this message that's being sent along a channel, right? So this is verbal and nonverbal and visual, right? So message is being sent along a channel. And there's feedback, right? So it isn't just linear, it isn't just one way, but there's feedback, both verbal and nonverbal feedback. That could be someone shaking their head, acknowledging that they're hearing you. That could be them paraphrasing or saying back to you what they've heard, right? So feedback from a person or from the audience. There's oftentimes interference, or another word for this is noise that gets in the way of this. Noise can be environmental. So it could be maybe the air conditioner is running really loud. We live in Chicago where the CTA goes around the loop. So maybe, if we had a window right outside where the train runs by, maybe that's environmental noise that gets in the way. We also have psychological noise or interference that get in the way. Maybe members of your audience have something else on their mind that's distracting them, right? And so we don't know what all those psychological interferences are, that psychological noise is, but we have to understand that that's part of the communication process and can either help or hinder the communication process. And then the situation, right? So the context, the environment, what's happening around us and to us while this communication process is happening. There's some other terminology when it comes to public speaking. You may hear the term oratory or rhetoric or forensics or speech. Oratory is kind of a very classical term. Rhetoric, we're going to talk a little bit more about rhetoric. Forensics is like speech competition, and of course speech or public speaking. We're going to pause right here, and then when we come back, we're going to pick up with what the Greeks said about public speaking, oratory, and rhetoric. And we're going to learn a little bit from them.